They called it survival, but most frontier families would remember winter by the children who didn't wake up come morning. Before central heating, before insulated walls, before the luxury of assuming warmth, there was the choice: stay warm or die. Tonight, we return to Montana Territory, winter of 1880, when temperatures dropped to -50 and ordinary families discovered that everything they thought they knew about cold was just the beginning. Morning breaks over the Morrison cabin. Frost covers every window. Breath hangs visible in the air, even indoors. Across the frontier settlement, families tend fires that have burned through the night, fathers splitting wood by lantern light, mothers wrapping heated stones in wool blankets, children learning that their survival depends on understanding why some logs burn longer than others. In that narrow space between warmth and death, you stand inside walls that are barely cool to the touch, while outside, the wind carries temperatures that would kill an unprotected person within hours. This is not a story of adventure or triumph. It's the slow work of keeping fire alive when letting it die means your family doesn't see spring moss packed between double walls. Body heat shared in calculated sleeping arrangements, emergency protocols practiced until they become automatic, and comfort measured in degrees rather than dreams. Welcome to American Sleepless Story, where forgotten moments from America's past become tonight's gentle companion. These are quiet stories told slowly, perfect for when your mind needs to wander somewhere peaceful. If you'd like more stories like this, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it where you are. I love knowing this community spans different places and time zones, all finding rest in the same American stories. Now, settle in, here comes the story. Thomas Morrison stands before his massive stone fireplace, the orange glow dancing across ice-covered windows, while outside, Montana's winter wind howls at -25 degrees. This isn't just a fire. It's a carefully engineered system that'll burn for 12 straight hours without fail. The difference between families who saw another spring and those who didn't often came down to understanding this simple truth. In the frontier, your heating system wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. Every split log, every stone placement, every damper adjustment was a calculated decision in an endless chess match against death itself. The Morrison family, like thousands of others scattered across the American wilderness, had turned fire-making into a precise science. Their lives depended on it, and they'd spent years perfecting techniques that would make modern engineers pause in admiration. The foundation of frontier thermal survival started with fireplace design that would put today's heating systems to shame. These weren't the decorative fireplaces you might remember from your childhood visits to Grandma's house. They were massive stone or brick structures with fireboxes deep enough to accommodate 4-foot logs. The engineering was brilliant in its simplicity. Angled sides reflected heat into the room rather than sending it up the chimney, while the back wall slanted forward to direct maximum warmth into the living space. Every frontier family understood that heat rises, so they built their fireplaces like thermal batteries. The chimney itself featured a damper system that controlled airflow with the precision of a finely tuned instrument. When you walked into one of these cabins on a bitter winter night, you could feel the difference immediately, that deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to wrap around you like a wool blanket fresh from the dryer. The thermal mass principle was perhaps the most ingenious aspect of these heating systems, though most families never knew the scientific term for what they were doing. Large stones and bricks absorbed heat during peak burning hours, then continued radiating that warmth long after the flames died down. Some families built elaborate stone heat sinks that extended from the fireplace into the room, creating what we'd now call thermal batteries. Picture walking barefoot across those warm stones on a winter morning, the luxury of heated floors without electricity, powered by nothing more than yesterday's fire and human ingenuity. These stone structures would stay warm to the touch for hours, sometimes well into the next day. Children would gather around these warm stone extensions to get dressed in the morning, their breath visible in the cabin air while their feet stayed toasty on the residual heat from the night before. But the real innovation lay in fuel preparation and management, an art form that took months of advanced planning and years to master. Families spent entire summers preparing for winter, cutting, splitting, and seasoning hardwood with the dedication of craftsmen preparing for their masterpiece. Oak, hickory, and maple were the gold standard because they burned hot and long, producing dense coals that maintained heat for hours without constant attention. The wood was split to specific sizes, large logs for overnight burning, medium splits for maintaining steady heat, and kindling for quick temperature boosts when the morning chill crept in. Every piece had its purpose, like instruments in an orchestra. You could tell an experienced frontier family by their wood pile, perfectly organized, properly seasoned, with each size of wood stacked in its designated area. Nothing was left to chance when your family's survival depended on keeping that fire burning all night long. The seasoning process was crucial for efficient burning, something many modern fireplace owners still don't fully understand. Green would contain too much moisture and would create smoke rather than heat, a dangerous mistake that could fill a cabin with deadly fumes or, worse yet, fail to provide life-saving warmth when temperatures plummeted. Properly seasoned wood had been cut and split in spring, then dried for at least 6 months in carefully constructed stacks that allowed air circulation while protecting from rain. Families could tell seasoned wood by its lighter weight, the way the ends cracked as they dried, and that distinctive hollow sound when two pieces were struck together. Children learned these tests early. Their survival might one day depend on choosing the right piece of wood in the dark. The sound of properly seasoned wood being loaded into a fireplace had its own rhythm, a percussion that meant safety and warmth for another night in the wilderness. Loading technique required understanding combustion science that would impress modern engineers, though frontier families learned it through trial and error rather than textbooks. Large logs were placed at the back of the firebox with smaller pieces in front, creating a staged burning system where the massive logs provided consistent background heat, while the smaller pieces could be adjusted for temperature control. The key was creating what they called a coal bed, a layer of glowing coals that could ignite new wood instantly and maintain consistent heat output throughout the night. This wasn't just throwing wood on a fire. It was building a carefully orchestrated combustion system. Watch an experienced frontier father load his fireplace and you'd see the precision of a surgeon, each log placed with purpose and understanding. The fire had to breathe just right, burn clean and hot, and most importantly, it had to last until morning without human intervention. Airflow management separated the experts from the amateurs, and in frontier winters, amateur mistakes were often fatal. Families learned to control their fire's intensity by adjusting dampers and managing air intake with the skill of master craftsmen. Too much air caused the fire to burn too quickly, wasting precious fuel that might not last until spring. Too little air caused incomplete combustion and dangerous smoke buildup that could poison a family in their sleep. The optimal airflow created a clean, hot burn that maximized heat output while conserving fuel. You could hear the difference. A properly managed fire had a steady, deep rumble rather than the angry roar of a fire burning too fast or the concerning silence of one starving for air. Experienced frontier parents could tell by sound alone whether their fire would last the night or need attention in a few hours. Overnight burning was the ultimate test of a heating system. The moment when everything you'd learned about fire management either saved your family or left you scrambling in deadly cold at 3 in the morning. Families developed techniques for banking fires that could burn unattended for 8 to 10 hours, a skill that literally meant the difference between life and death on the coldest nights. This involved loading the firebox with large hardwood logs, adjusting the damper to reduce airflow just enough to slow combustion, and covering the coals with a thin layer of ash to control the burn rate. A properly banked fire would still have live coals in the morning, glowing embers that could be revived with kindling and fresh air to start another day. The relief of waking up to find those coals still alive was something modern Americans, with their thermostats and electric heat, could never fully understand. Those glowing embers meant your family had survived another night. Heat distribution required strategic thinking about thermal mass and air circulation that turned cabins into efficient heating systems. Large stones were heated in the fire during the day, then carefully moved with iron tools to beds and corners of the cabin where they'd radiate heat throughout the night. Some families built permanent stone or brick heat sinks near their fireplaces that absorbed heat during peak burning and released it slowly over hours, like giant thermal batteries powered by wood instead of electricity. Children would warm their clothes on these heated stones before getting dressed, and families would heat flat stones to place in beds as primitive but effective foot warmers. The whole cabin became a heat management system, with warm air circulation patterns that families understood and optimized. Cool air entered at floor level, warmed by the fire, rose to the ceiling, and circulated back down, creating natural convection currents that distributed heat throughout the living space. Cooking integration maximized the utility of heating systems in ways that would make modern efficiency experts envious, turning every BTU into multiple benefits for the family's survival. Frontier families designed their fireplaces to accommodate cooking pots and baking ovens, using the same fire that kept them warm to prepare meals and preserve food. This efficiency was crucial when fuel was limited and every piece of wood had to serve multiple purposes. A single well-managed fire could heat the cabin, cook dinner, bake bread, warm water for washing, and provide light for evening activities. The integration was seamless. Families planned their cooking around their heating needs and vice versa. As one frontier settler wrote in her diary, "A good fire is like a good friend. It keeps you warm all night and is still there in the morning, ready to cook your breakfast." These heating systems weren't just about survival. They were about creating sustainable comfort in an unforgiving wilderness, where every innovation meant another day of life. Sarah Morrison runs her hand along the interior wall of their cabin, feeling warmth trapped between the double wall construction, while outside, temperatures have dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The interior wall is barely cool to the touch, and hidden between these walls lies a sophisticated insulation system built from materials the forest provided for free, and it works better than anything available in the cities of 1880. This wasn't crude frontier desperation. This was engineering born from necessity, creating thermal barriers that rivaled modern materials using only what nature offered. The double wall cavity holds secrets that would make contemporary builders pause in admiration. Families like the Morrisons had revolutionized insulation through pure survival instinct, developing systems that could maintain interior temperatures 60 to 70 degrees warmer than outside conditions. Every gap, every air pocket, every layer of natural material was placed with the precision of architects who understood that one mistake could mean a sleepless night of fighting hypothermia, or worse. The double wall construction formed the foundation of frontier thermal protection, a technique that modern construction still uses today, though few realize its humble American origins. Families built cabin walls with inner and outer layers of logs, creating a cavity 6 to 8 inches wide that could be filled with insulating material. The outer wall faced the brutal weather while the inner wall created a warm, dry interior surface that children could lean against without feeling the bite of winter wind. This air gap was the secret of dead air space that broke the thermal bridge between outside cold and inside warmth. When you touched the interior wall on a bitter morning, you felt only gentle coolness instead of the shock of frozen wood. The engineering principle was simple but brilliant. Create a buffer zone where cold air could swirl harmlessly while warm air stayed trapped inside. Frontier families understood thermodynamics without ever reading a physics textbook, learning through trial and error what worked when your family's life depended on staying warm. The insulation materials were harvested from the surrounding environment with a careful selection of craftsmen choosing their finest tools. Dried moss became the primary filler, particularly sphagnum moss with its natural antimicrobial properties and excellent thermal resistance. Families collected moss in late summer when it was dry and at its peak insulating capacity, spending entire afternoons gathering what would become their winter survival kit. The moss created thousands of tiny air pockets that trapped heat and prevented cold transfer, nature's own version of modern foam insulation. Children learned to identify the best moss types, understanding that their winter comfort depended on these seemingly boring summer expeditions. The collected moss was dried thoroughly and packed tightly between walls, creating a barrier that could maintain warmth for months. Walking through a properly insulated frontier cabin felt like stepping into a different climate zone, where the outside world's harsh reality seemed suddenly distant and manageable. Animal hair and fur provided additional insulation layers that transformed waste products into life-saving materials. Families saved hair from butchered animals, fur from trapped game, and even human hair from regular haircuts. Nothing that could provide warmth was ever discarded. This material was mixed with moss to create dense, warm barriers that trapped air while adding extra thermal mass. Some families used down feathers from waterfowl, creating insulation remarkably similar to modern down jackets. The preparation was meticulous. Hair was cleaned, sorted, and layered strategically for maximum efficiency. Picture the careful process of Sarah Morrison sorting through collected materials on an autumn afternoon, separating the finest hair for the most critical wall sections while coarser materials went to less crucial areas. The rhythm of this preparation work was almost meditative, sorting, cleaning, and preparing materials while knowing that each handful might mean the difference between comfortable sleep and shivering through another long winter night. Clay and mud chinking sealed gaps between logs and insulation with the precision of master craftsmen creating airtight seals. This wasn't simply stuffing cracks with mud. It was creating an integrated sealing system that prevented heat loss through convection while maintaining structural integrity. The chinking mixture was prepared with animal hair or chopped straw to prevent cracking as it dried, and families applied it in multiple layers for maximum effectiveness. Each application had to cure properly before the next layer, turning wall maintenance into a seasonal ritual that required patience and skill. The final chinking layer was often mixed with ash or lime to create a harder, more durable surface that could withstand thermal expansion and contraction. Children learned to identify where chinking needed repair by feeling for cold spots along walls. Their small hands could detect temperature variations that indicated gaps in the thermal envelope. The maintenance was ongoing, but the reward was a cabin that stayed warm even when Montana winds howled like banshees outside. Floor insulation required understanding that cold rises from the ground just as surely as heat rises to the ceiling, creating thermal challenges that demanded creative solutions. Families built raised floors with crawl spaces underneath that could be filled with insulating materials, dried leaves, straw, and animal bedding that created thermal barriers preventing ground cold from penetrating the living space. Some ingenious families kept small animals, like chickens, under the floor during winter, using their body heat as an additional warming source while protecting the birds from predators and weather. The chickens stayed warm and continued laying eggs, while their body heat contributed to the cabin's overall thermal management. Picture the gentle sounds of chickens settling down for the night beneath your feet, their presence adding both warmth and a comforting reminder of life continuing even in the harshest conditions. This multi-purpose thinking characterized frontier life. Every element served multiple functions, and nothing was wasted when survival depended on efficiency. Window and door sealing required special attention because these openings were the primary sources of heat loss in otherwise well-insulated structures. Families hung heavy blankets or furs over windows at night, creating additional insulation layers that could be removed during daylight hours for visibility and light. Doors were fitted with leather or fur strips around the edges to prevent drafts, and many families built double door entries with small vestibules that prevented cold air from entering the main living space directly. The vestibule concept was brilliant, a small buffer zone where cold air could be trapped and gradually warmed before entering the main cabin. children learned to move quickly through these transition spaces, understanding that every second the outer door stayed open meant heat loss that would take precious fuel to replace. Some families even created curtained sleeping areas within the main room, using hanging furs or heavy fabric to create smaller, more easily heated spaces around beds. These microclimates within the cabin allowed families to concentrate their body heat and conserve the warmth their fire had worked so hard to create. Roof insulation proved critical because heat rises relentlessly toward the sky, and families learned that an uninsulated roof was like trying to heat the entire outdoors. They built thick sod roofs with multiple layers of insulating materials that created some of the most effective thermal barriers in the entire structure. The bottom layer was usually bark or split wood, followed by layers of moss, leaves, and finally thick sod that provided both waterproofing and insulation. These roofs could be 2 feet thick or more, creating thermal mass that absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. The weight was substantial, requiring strong timber construction, but the thermal benefits made the extra engineering effort worthwhile. Walking on these sod roofs in winter was like stepping on frozen ground. The grass and earth above provided such effective insulation that snow would accumulate without melting, creating an additional insulating layer. Some families even grew gardens on their roofs during summer, turning their insulation system into food production while maintaining its thermal properties. Maintenance was an ongoing responsibility throughout the winter months, requiring constant vigilance and regular repairs that could mean the difference between comfort and catastrophe. Families regularly checked chinking for cracks caused by thermal expansion and contraction, adding fresh insulation material as settling occurred, and repairing any damage that could compromise the thermal envelope. A small gap in insulation could create a cold spot that would freeze water containers or make sleeping impossible in that area of the cabin. Children were taught to identify problem areas by feeling for drafts or temperature variations, turning insulation maintenance into a family responsibility that everyone understood and participated in. The work was tedious but essential, running your hand along interior walls, checking for loose chinking, adding moss where settling had occurred, and ensuring that every potential heat leak was identified and sealed. Winter maintenance couldn't wait for spring. Problems had to be addressed immediately, often in the middle of bitter cold nights when the consequences of heat loss became immediately apparent. These insulation systems represented a revolution in thermal engineering that happened not in universities or laboratories, but in tiny cabins scattered across the American frontier where innovation was driven by the simple need to survive another night. Families developed techniques that modern builders still use, creating thermal envelopes that could maintain comfortable interior temperatures even when outside conditions would kill an unprotected person within hours. The materials were free, renewable, and completely natural, yet they performed as well as manufactured insulation, costing hundreds of dollars in today's economy. Sarah Morrison's warm interior walls were testimony to human ingenuity applied under pressure, where every technique had to work perfectly because there were no second chances in the wilderness. These frontier families had turned their cabins into thermal fortresses, creating islands of warmth in an ocean of deadly cold, and their methods would influence American building techniques for generations to come. But insulation was only part of the survival equation. Even the best thermal barriers meant nothing without understanding how to manage the heat source that made it all possible. The Morrison children sleep peacefully in their shared bed, surrounded by heated stones, wrapped in wool blankets, and covered with layers of furs and quilts that their grandmother had sewn during long winter evenings years before. Their combined body heat, mixed with the thermal mass of those carefully warmed stones, creates a microenvironment that will keep them comfortable through the entire night, even as temperatures outside plummet to levels that would kill an unprotected person within hours. This isn't just bedding thrown together for comfort. It's a sophisticated personal heating system that could mean the difference between waking up healthy or hypothermic, between starting another day or never seeing morning again. Frontier families understood that managing body heat was just as crucial as heating the cabin itself, requiring techniques that maximize the human body's natural heat production while minimizing loss through radiation, conduction, and convection. Every layer of clothing, every sleeping arrangement, every heated stone was part of a calculated strategy for survival that turned the human body into a furnace capable of sustaining life in impossible conditions. The layering system formed the foundation of body heat management, creating personal insulation that worked on the same principles as their cabin walls but adapted for constant movement and daily activities. Families wore multiple layers of clothing that trapped air between them, creating insulation similar to what we'd recognize today as modern thermal wear, though made entirely from natural materials their own hands had prepared. The base layer was usually fine linen or wool worn directly against the skin, followed by wool shirts, vests, and outer garments that could be added or removed as conditions changed throughout the day. Each layer trapped air and created thermal barriers that kept body heat close to the skin while allowing moisture to move outward, preventing the dangerous chill that came from wearing damp clothing in freezing temperatures. Children learned early to adjust their layers based on activity level, adding clothes before going outside to tend animals, removing outer layers during physical work to prevent overheating and sweating, then quickly adding them back when the work was done and their bodies began to cool. Wool became the preferred material for winter clothing because it retained insulating properties even when damp from perspiration, a crucial advantage when physical work was necessary for survival, but overheating could be dangerous. Frontier families raised sheep specifically for wool production, and women spent countless hours spinning, weaving, and knitting warm clothing that would last for years under harsh conditions. A complete winter outfit for one person could represent months of work, from shearing sheep in spring, through washing and preparing the wool, spinning it into yarn, weaving or knitting it into fabric and garments, and finally finishing each piece with the care of someone whose family's survival depended on the quality of their work. The wool held warmth even when wet, unlike cotton or linen that became dangerously cold when moisture was present. Children wore wool against their skin, wool shirts and sweaters, wool stockings, and wool caps that could be pulled down to cover ears and necks. The material felt scratchy at first, but frontier children learned to appreciate that slight roughness because it meant warmth, safety, and another day of life in the wilderness. The heated stone system represented frontier innovation at its most practical, providing hours of localized warmth that could sustain body temperature through the longest, coldest nights. Large stones were selected for their ability to hold heat without cracking. River stones that had been tested by repeated heating and cooling cycles until families found ones that could withstand the thermal stress of being heated to almost unbearable temperatures, then slowly releasing that heat over 6 to 8 hours. These stones were heated in the fire until they were almost hot to handle, then carefully wrapped in wool blankets and placed in beds before sleep, creating personal heating systems that required no fuel and made no noise. The process had to be timed perfectly. Stones heated too early would cool before morning, while stones heated too late might still be dangerously hot when placed in bed. Children learned to test stone temperature by holding their hands near the wrapped bundle, feeling for that perfect balance between useful heat and dangerous burns. Some families used heated bricks or metal objects for the same purpose, but stones held heat longest and were safest for overnight use. Shared body heat became a survival strategy that required careful planning and family coordination, turning sleeping arrangements into tactical decisions that could save lives during the coldest nights. Families slept together in shared beds not just for space efficiency, but because combining body heat created warm sleeping environments that individual beds could never achieve. Children slept between adults, taking advantage of the higher heat production of larger people while contributing their own warmth to the family unit. Parents positioned themselves strategically, the largest adult on the outside edge where heat loss was greatest. Smaller children in the protected center where temperatures stayed most stable throughout the night. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about preventing hypothermia in the most vulnerable family members who produced less body heat and lost it more quickly. The shared sleeping created bonds that went beyond family relationships. When your survival depended on sharing warmth with others, you developed trust and intimacy that modern families, with their separate heated bedrooms, might never experience. Bed construction was engineered specifically for heat retention, using techniques that turned sleeping areas into thermal sanctuaries where warmth could be captured and held throughout the night. Frontier beds were built with thick straw or feather mattresses that provided insulation from the cold floor, elevating sleepers away from the ground where cold air settled and accumulated. Multiple layers of blankets, quilts, and furs created thermal envelopes around the sleepers, with each layer trapping air and building insulation that worked like personal cabin walls. Some families built enclosed bed areas with curtains that could be drawn to trap warm air and create even smaller, more easily heated spaces within the already insulated cabin. The bed became a room within a room, a warm sanctuary where body heat could accumulate and be preserved through the night. Heavy quilts made from scraps of wool fabric, filled with down feathers or wool batting, provided both weight and insulation. The weight was important. It pressed the layers together, eliminating air gaps where heat could escape while creating intimate contact between sleepers and their thermal barriers. Hot food and drinks served as internal heating systems, strategically consumed to raise core body temperature before sleep and provide fuel for the body's natural heat production throughout the night. Families consumed hot soup, tea, or warm milk in the evening, not just for nutrition, but for the immediate temperature elevation that could last for hours after consumption. The digestive process itself generated heat as the body worked to process nutrients, creating internal warmth that supplemented external heating systems. Hot drinks served before bed provided comfort and immediate warming, while warm food in the stomach created a thermal core that radiated heat outward to hands, feet, and extremities. Children learned to appreciate the sleepy warmth that came after a bowl of hot stew or a cup of warm milk sweetened with honey, that drowsy, comfortable feeling that made climbing into a cold bed more bearable because warmth was already building from inside their bodies. Some families prepared special warming drinks with herbs or spices that promoted circulation, understanding instinctively that better blood flow meant better heat distribution throughout the body. Exercise and movement were used strategically to generate heat when other warming methods weren't sufficient or available, turning physical activity into a survival tool that could be deployed whenever dangerous cold threatened. Families developed indoor exercises that could be performed in the small spaces of their cabins, calisthenics that increased circulation and heat production without requiring equipment or large areas for movement. Children were taught to move their fingers and toes regularly to prevent frostbite, and adults used systematic movement routines to warm up when they felt cold beginning to penetrate their defenses. The exercises were simple but effective: arm swings, leg lifts, stretching routines that could be done near the fire or even in bed if necessary. Physical work became heating work. Chopping wood, carrying water, or tending animals served the dual purpose of accomplishing necessary tasks while generating body heat that could last for hours. Families understood that a body in motion was a warm body, and they planned their daily activities to include movement that would help maintain core temperature even when fuel for heating was scarce. Breathing techniques provided a lesser-known but remarkably effective warming method that could be used anywhere, anytime, without equipment or preparation. Families learned to breathe warm air into their hands or under blankets to create pockets of heated air that could warm extremities and provide temporary relief from cold. This technique was particularly useful for warming hands and feet that were prone to frostbite, or for creating warm microclimates inside clothing or bedding. The method was simple but required practice. breathing slowly and deeply into cupped hands, then quickly moving those hands to cold areas of the body before the warmed air could escape. Children learn to breathe warm air inside their shirts or under blankets, creating personal heating systems that used nothing but their own breath and understanding of how warm air behaved in enclosed spaces. Some families taught controlled breathing exercises that increased circulation and heat production throughout the body, understanding that proper breathing could enhance the effectiveness of all their other warming techniques. The rhythm of warm breathing became almost meditative, a calming practice that provided both physical warmth and psychological comfort during the long, dark winter nights. Emergency warming protocols were essential knowledge for situations when normal heating systems failed and hypothermia became an immediate threat to family survival. Every frontier family knew how to recognize the early signs of dangerous cooling, shivering that couldn't be controlled, confusion or disorientation, loss of coordination, and the eventual unconsciousness that preceded death from cold. The treatment involved specific procedures for rewarming affected individuals, immediate skin-to-skin contact with the warmest family member, warm liquid consumption if the person was conscious, and careful monitoring to prevent rewarming shock that could be as dangerous as the original hypothermia. Families practiced these procedures because in a true emergency, there would be no time to figure out what to do. Actions had to be automatic and immediate. The emergency warming formation placed the hypothermic person in direct contact with warm skin, usually an adult male who generated the most body heat, then wrapped both in dry blankets and furs while other family members prepared warm drinks or worked to restart heating systems. As frontier Dr. Samuel Thompson noted in his 1825 medical guide, the human body is the best heater you'll ever have, but only if you know how to use it properly. These personal heating systems kept frontier families alive through the harshest conditions, but when storms raged and temperatures dropped beyond what even the best body heat management could handle, the fire has gone out, and Thomas Morrison wakes to the sound of his youngest daughter's teeth chattering uncontrollably in the pre-dawn darkness, her small body shaking despite the layers of quilts and furs that had seemed adequate when the family went to sleep. He can see his own breath in the cabin air, and the interior temperature is dropping fast toward the deadly range where human survival becomes measured in minutes rather than hours. Outside, temperatures have plummeted to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and without their primary heat source, the Morrison cabin is rapidly becoming as dangerous as the wilderness beyond its walls. Thomas has maybe 30 minutes before hypothermia becomes a real threat to his family, maybe an hour before the situation becomes irreversible. This is the moment when emergency protocols mean the difference between survival and tragedy, when years of preparation and practiced procedures either save lives or prove insufficient against the brutal mathematics of frontier winter. Every frontier family lived with this possibility, and those who survived developed sophisticated emergency procedures for thermal crisis because in the wilderness, there was no one to call for help. Emergency protocols were practiced, memorized, and executed with military precision because lives depended on split-second decisions and flawless execution when normal heating systems failed. Families couldn't afford to figure out solutions during an actual crisis. Every procedure had to be rehearsed until it became automatic, because panic and confusion could be as deadly as the cold itself. Children learned their roles in emergency situations just as they learned to walk and talk, understanding that family survival depended on everyone knowing exactly what to do when catastrophe struck. The protocols covered multiple scenarios: fires that died during the night, heating systems that failed during extreme weather, situations where fuel ran out before spring, and emergencies where family members showed signs of hypothermia or frostbite. Each situation required different responses, but all shared the same urgency and precision. Families held practice drills during milder weather, timing how quickly they could restart fires, relocate to emergency heating areas, or implement body warming procedures. These weren't games. They were survival training that could save lives when real emergencies occurred and there was no margin for error or hesitation. The fire restart procedure represented the most critical emergency skill because fire meant life, and life without fire meant death within hours when temperatures dropped to extremes. Families maintained emergency fire starting materials in multiple locations throughout their cabins: dry tinder, kindling, and fire starting tools that were always ready for immediate use regardless of weather conditions or time of day. The key was having materials that could create flame even in extremely cold conditions when normal fire starting became difficult or impossible due to frozen hands, damp materials, or equipment failure. Emergency tinder was specially prepared for cold weather ignition. Birch bark collected and stored in waterproof containers, pine pitch that would ignite even when everything else was too cold, and dry moss that had been processed specifically for emergency use. Some families prepared char cloth, fabric that had been partially burned to create material that would catch spark instantly and burn hot enough to ignite kindling even in sub-zero conditions. The emergency fire kit was checked regularly, protected from moisture, and positioned where it could be reached quickly in total darkness because emergencies rarely waited for convenient timing or adequate lighting. Rapid warming techniques required understanding of heat transfer and human physiology that could save lives when family members showed signs of hypothermia or dangerous cooling. When someone exhibited symptoms of severe cold exposure, uncontrollable shivering, confusion, loss of coordination, or bluish skin color, the protocol was immediate skin-to-skin contact with the warmest family member, usually an adult male who generated the most body heat and had the greatest thermal mass. The hypothermic person was stripped of cold, wet clothing and placed in direct contact with warm skin. Then both were wrapped in dry blankets and furs while the warming process began. This wasn't gradual, it was aggressive rewarming that had to begin immediately before body core temperature dropped to dangerous levels. The warming person had to maintain contact until the victim's shivering stopped and normal color returned to their skin, a process that could take hours and required significant sacrifice from the warming family member. Additional family members contributed by preparing warm drinks, maintaining heating systems, and providing extra insulation around the warming pair. The procedure was exhausting for everyone involved, but it was the difference between saving a family member and losing them to the cold. Emergency heat source creation used any available combustible material when normal firewood wasn't sufficient to maintain life-saving heat during extreme conditions. Families understood that survival took priority over property preservation, and they were prepared to burn furniture, clothing, books, tools, or even structural elements of their cabins if necessary to maintain temperatures that would keep their families alive. The decision matrix was simple. Anything that could burn was potential fuel when human life was at stake. Families identified which items could be sacrificed first: broken furniture, worn-out clothing, damaged tools, and which structural elements could be removed without compromising the cabin's integrity. Chairs could be broken apart for kindling, tables could provide hours of fuel, and even interior wall boards could be sacrificed if the alternative was freezing to death. Children learned this hierarchy of sacrifice, understanding that objects could be replaced, but lives could not. Some families prepared emergency fuel supplies specifically for crisis situations: bundles of wood shavings, broken furniture stored for emergency use, and combustible materials that were designated for life or death situations when normal fuel supplies were exhausted or inaccessible. The group warming formation was a tactical arrangement that maximized shared body heat during emergencies when external heating wasn't available or sufficient to maintain survivable temperatures. Family members arranged themselves in a specific pattern that had been practiced and perfected. Largest adults on the outside where heat loss was greatest, children and elderly members in the center where they could benefit from the heat production of others while contributing their own warmth to the group. This human heat source could sustain life even without external heating, creating a warm microclimate that maintained survivable temperatures for hours when properly executed. The formation required physical contact and shared body heat, with family members removing outer clothing to maximize skin-to-skin contact while maintaining enough clothing to preserve modesty and prevent heat loss to the environment. Blankets and furs were arranged to create a thermal envelope around the entire group, trapping their combined body heat and preventing its escape to the cold cabin air. The position had to be maintained for hours if necessary, with family members taking turns being on the outside edges where heat loss was greatest, ensuring that no individual became dangerously cold while protecting the group as a whole. Emergency food protocols focused on high-calorie, heat-generating foods that could raise core body temperature quickly and provide fuel for the body's natural heat production during crisis situations. Families maintained emergency stores of fat, honey, alcohol, and concentrated foods that could provide immediate energy for heat production without requiring extensive preparation or cooking time. These foods were consumed in specific quantities calculated to maximize internal heat generation without causing digestive distress that could worsen the emergency situation. Fat provided the most concentrated energy and burned longest in the body's metabolic furnace, while honey offered quick energy that could be converted to heat almost immediately. Small amounts of alcohol could increase circulation and provide warming sensations, though families had to be careful not to use too much since alcohol could actually increase heat loss through vasodilation. The emergency foods were stored in easily accessible locations and rotated regularly to ensure freshness when they were needed. Children learned which foods provided the most warming effect and how much to consume during different types of emergency situations. The goal was to fuel the body's internal heating system when external heat sources were insufficient or unavailable. Shelter modification techniques allowed families to create smaller, more easily heated spaces within their cabins during extreme emergencies when normal heating systems couldn't maintain survivable temperatures in the entire structure. Using blankets, furs, furniture, and rope, families could create tent-like emergency shelters around their fireplaces or in corners of their cabins that trapped heat in much smaller volumes, making it possible to maintain warmth with minimal fuel. These emergency shelters worked on the principle that heating a smaller space required less energy and could be maintained even when fuel was scarce or heating systems were operating at reduced capacity. The construction had to be quick and efficient, using materials that were readily available and techniques that could be implemented in cold conditions by family members whose manual dexterity might be compromised by cold exposure. The emergency shelter created a room within a room, concentrating body heat and any available external heat in a space small enough to be warmed effectively. Families practiced building these emergency shelters during milder weather, timing how quickly they could construct them and testing their effectiveness at heat retention. When properly built, an emergency shelter could maintain survivable temperatures with nothing more than body heat and a small fire, turning a freezing cabin into a livable space until normal heating could be restored. Hypothermia recognition and treatment protocols were based on frontier medical knowledge that was surprisingly sophisticated, developed through hard experience with cold-related injuries and deaths that taught families exactly what symptoms to watch for and how to respond. Families knew the progressive signs of hypothermia: initial shivering that gradually became uncontrollable, confusion and disorientation that made victims unable to help themselves, loss of coordination that prevented normal movement, and eventual unconsciousness that preceded death if treatment wasn't immediate and effective. The treatment protocols involved gradual rewarming techniques that prevented shock while gradually raising core body temperature back to safe levels. Rapid rewarming could be as dangerous as the original hypothermia, causing cardiac complications or other medical emergencies that frontier families were ill-equipped to handle. The rewarming process included warm liquid consumption for conscious victims, skin-to-skin contact for heat transfer, and careful monitoring to ensure that the warming process continued steadily without becoming dangerous. Families learned to recognize when someone was beyond their ability to treat and when more aggressive measures were necessary. As frontier survival expert Daniel Boone wrote in his 1784 Wilderness Guide, "In the wilderness, you don't get a second chance to save your family from the cold. Your emergency plan has to work the first time, every time." These emergency protocols represented the last line of defense against frontier winter's deadly cold, but even the best emergency procedures were no substitute for understanding how to prevent crises before they developed. The psychological preparation was equally important as physical techniques because panic could be fatal during thermal emergencies, turning manageable situations into deadly crises through poor decision-making and wasted energy. Frontier families understood that mental discipline was as crucial as any heating system, requiring emotional control and clear thinking when lives hung in the balance and there was no room for mistakes or hesitation. Children were taught from early ages that winter survival demanded calm minds and steady hands, that fear and panic consumed energy needed for survival while clouding judgment that had to remain sharp during emergencies. Families practiced emergency procedures regularly during milder weather, ensuring that even children knew their roles during crisis situations and could execute life-saving actions without conscious thought or emotional interference. The mental rehearsal was as important as physical practice. Families talked through emergency scenarios, discussed decision-making processes, and prepared psychologically for situations where everything could go wrong simultaneously. This wasn't morbid obsession with disaster. It was practical preparation that turned potentially paralyzing situations into manageable problems with known solutions. When real emergencies occurred, trained responses became automatic rather than requiring conscious decisions that cold and fear might prevent. Equipment maintenance protocols ensured that emergency tools and heating systems remained functional when needed, because frontier families couldn't afford to discover that critical equipment was broken during actual emergencies when lives depended on immediate action. Fire-starting equipment was checked daily, flint and steel tested for spark production, tinder examined for dryness and combustibility, and kindling supplies assessed for adequacy and accessibility in dark or emergency conditions. Emergency fuel supplies were rotated and replenished constantly, with families maintaining strategic reserves that could sustain heating for extended periods without access to normal wood supplies. Backup heating devices were tested regularly to ensure they functioned properly when called upon. Small braziers, metal warming containers, and portable heating systems that could provide localized heat when main fireplaces failed or fuel ran short. The maintenance wasn't just checking equipment. It was understanding how each tool worked, what could go wrong with it, and how to repair or improvise replacements using available materials. Children learned to identify equipment problems and understand maintenance schedules because their survival might depend on recognizing when heating systems needed attention before they failed completely during critical conditions. The survival timeline awareness helped families understand exactly how long they could survive under different conditions, providing crucial information for decision-making during emergencies when time limits determined which actions were possible and which were futile. At -40 degrees Fahrenheit, an unheated cabin would become uninhabitable within 2 to 3 hours. Interior temperatures dropped toward levels that could cause hypothermia in sleeping family members. Human survival without external heat sources was measured in hours rather than days, and families understood these time constraints intimately because their emergency planning depended on realistic assessments of how long they had to implement solutions before situations became irreversible. The knowledge drove urgency and precision in emergency responses. Families knew they couldn't afford to waste time on solutions that wouldn't work quickly enough, and they prioritized actions that provided the fastest results when time was running short. Different family members had different survival times based on age, size, and health, with children and elderly members requiring faster response times and more aggressive warming measures. The timeline awareness prevented false optimism and wishful thinking that could waste precious time during real emergencies when every minute counted toward survival or death. Backup heating systems provided redundancy when primary fireplaces couldn't meet heating demands during extreme weather conditions or fuel shortages that left families without adequate warming capacity. Some families maintained small braziers or metal containers that could burn charcoal or wood scraps indoors, providing localized heat for critical body areas when main heating systems were insufficient or failed completely. Others used heated metal objects, tools, cookware, or specially designed warming devices that could be heated in fires and then moved to beds or clothing to provide personal warmth that lasted for hours. These backup systems were particularly important during extreme cold snaps when single heat sources weren't sufficient to maintain survivable temperatures throughout entire cabins. The systems had to be safe for indoor use, efficient with limited fuel supplies, and capable of operation by family members whose manual dexterity might be compromised by cold exposure. Families practiced using backup heating systems during non-emergency conditions, learning their capabilities and limitations before depending on them during life-threatening situations. The redundancy provided psychological comfort as much as practical backup. Knowing that multiple heating options were available reduced anxiety and allowed families to sleep better during the coldest nights when single-point failures could be catastrophic. The community support networks provided additional safety nets during extreme weather events that overwhelmed individual family heating systems or emergency supplies. Frontier communities developed signaling methods that allowed families to communicate distress and request assistance when their own survival systems were failing. Smoke signals during daylight hours, reflected light from mirrors or polished metal, and sound signals that could travel long distances in cold air. These distress signals triggered immediate response from anyone within range, because frontier communities understood that every family's survival strengthened the entire settlement's chances of making it through harsh winters. Neighbors would respond to emergency signals even in dangerous conditions, bringing additional fuel, emergency supplies, or assistance with heating system repairs that individual families couldn't manage alone. The community response was formalized through agreements and protocols that ensured help would come when needed. But families couldn't depend entirely on outside assistance because weather conditions might prevent neighbors from responding quickly enough to save lives. The support networks provided both practical assistance and psychological comfort. Knowing that help was available reduced the isolation and fear that could paralyze decision-making during emergencies. While understanding the limitations of outside help encouraged families to maintain their own comprehensive survival preparations. Equipment rotation and testing ensured that emergency supplies remained functional throughout long winter seasons when they might not be used for months but had to work perfectly when called upon during life-threatening situations. Families maintained detailed knowledge of their emergency equipment condition, regularly rotating stored supplies to prevent deterioration and testing critical items to verify continued functionality. Fire-starting materials were replaced seasonally, with old supplies used for practice and new materials stored for emergency use. Backup fuel supplies were used and replenished in rotation, preventing storage problems that could make emergency fuel unusable when it was desperately needed. Heating equipment was tested monthly, not just for functionality, but for efficiency and safety in actual use conditions. The testing provided opportunities to practice emergency procedures while verifying that equipment would perform as expected during real crises. Families kept detailed mental inventories of their emergency supplies, knowing exactly what was available, where it was stored, and how long it would last under different usage conditions. This knowledge was shared among all family members old enough to understand, ensuring that multiple people could locate and use emergency equipment if primary family members were incapacitated or unavailable during crisis situations. The psychological resilience training prepared families for the mental challenges of surviving extended periods of extreme cold, isolation, and constant threat that could break down emotional stability and decision-making capacity over time. Frontier winters were long, dark, and filled with daily reminders of how close families lived to death, creating psychological stress that could be as dangerous as physical cold if it led to poor decisions or paralysis during emergencies. Families developed mental disciplines that maintained emotional stability, daily routines that provided structure and normalcy, storytelling and games that occupied minds during long dark evenings, and shared activities that reinforced family bonds and mutual support systems. The resilience training included acceptance of harsh realities without becoming overwhelmed by them, understanding that survival required clear thinking rather than emotional reactions to difficult circumstances. Children learned to find comfort in routine maintenance activities, taking pride in their contributions to family survival while understanding the serious consequences of carelessness or panic. Adults modeled calm behavior during stressful situations, demonstrating that problems could be solved through systematic thinking and practiced procedures rather than emotional responses that wasted energy and clouded judgment. The knowledge transfer systems ensured that survival skills passed from experienced family members to children and newcomers, preserving critical information that had been learned through hard experience and couldn't be allowed to disappear through death or memory loss. Older family members, not just techniques, but the reasoning behind them, helping younger members understand why certain procedures were necessary and how to adapt them to different situations. The teaching included stories of past emergencies and how they were handled, providing case studies that illustrated both successful techniques and dangerous mistakes that should be avoided. Knowledge was reinforced through regular practice and testing, with family members demonstrating their understanding of emergency procedures and equipment operation to ensure competency when real situations arose. The transfer process continued throughout winter seasons, with ongoing discussions of survival techniques, equipment maintenance, and emergency planning that kept critical knowledge fresh and accessible. Families understood that survival knowledge was their most valuable possession, more important than any physical equipment or supplies, because knowledge could be used to improvise solutions when equipment failed or supplies ran short. This accumulated wisdom, passed down through generations of frontier families, created survival expertise that meant the difference between life and death when winter showed no mercy and families had to depend entirely on their own skills and preparation to see another spring. The Morrison family made it through that winter of 1880, and thousands more just like it, not because they were stronger or braver than we are today, but because they understood something we've forgotten in our climate-controlled world. Survival wasn't about conquering nature, it was about working with it, using what the forest provided, and finding comfort in the simple act of being prepared for whatever came next. Their heated stones grew cold by morning, but their knowledge stayed warm, passed down through generations who understood that the most important skill wasn't knowing how to get warm, but knowing how to stay that way. Think about Thomas Morrison checking his fire one last time before bed, adjusting the damper with the precision of a master craftsman, banking coals that would burn through the night without supervision. His children slept peacefully not because they had central heating, but because they trusted their father's knowledge of combustion science learned through years of practice when mistakes meant death. Sarah Morrison's hands running along warm interior walls weren't feeling luxury. They were confirming that her family's thermal engineering worked exactly as designed, that double wall construction and natural insulation were keeping deadly cold at bay while her family dreamed safely. These frontier families discovered something we've lost in our rush toward convenience: the deep satisfaction that comes from understanding exactly how the systems that keep you alive actually work. They knew the sound of properly seasoned wood burning clean, the feel of heated stones that would warm beds for 8 hours, the precise airflow adjustments that made fires burn efficiently through Montana nights. Their knowledge wasn't theoretical, it was practical, tested, refined through seasons when getting it wrong meant not seeing spring. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep in a room where temperature never varies more than a few degrees, think about the Morrison children sharing body heat under layers of wool and fur, their breath visible in the cabin air while their feet stayed toasty against stones their father had heated hours before. There's something deeply satisfying about understanding how people found peace in harsh conditions, how they turned survival into routine, and how they slept soundly knowing their preparations would keep them alive through the night. These frontier families discovered that comfort isn't about having everything you want, it's about knowing exactly how to take care of what you need. The rituals of frontier winter survival had their own meditative quality, the daily checking of equipment, the seasonal preparation of materials, the ongoing maintenance that kept thermal systems functioning perfectly. Children learned these rhythms early, understanding that family survival depended on everyone knowing their role in the complex dance of staying warm. There was comfort in the routine, peace in the repetition, satisfaction in the knowledge that each task performed correctly contributed to another night of safety and warmth. We live in a world where survival is assumed rather than earned, where warmth comes from flipping switches rather than splitting wood, where emergency protocols involve calling someone else rather than knowing what to do ourselves. Maybe that's progress, or maybe we've lost something important in the process, that deep satisfaction that comes from understanding how things work when they absolutely have to work. The Morrison family would find our modern heating systems miraculous, but they might also wonder what we do with all that mental energy we no longer spend on staying alive. Their minds were occupied with purposeful work, their sleep earned through daily effort, their peace found in the rhythm of tasks that actually mattered. Consider the psychological comfort that came from comprehensive preparation, knowing that emergency protocols had been practiced until they became automatic, that backup heating systems were tested and ready, that every family member understood their role when normal systems failed. This was an anxious preparation born from fear. It was confident readiness that allowed families to sleep peacefully because they knew they could handle whatever winter threw at them. The preparation itself became a source of comfort, a meditative practice that created security through understanding and readiness. The techniques that kept frontier families alive through Montana winter still work today when modern systems fail, and we're reminded that comfort is more fragile than we like to admit. Double wall construction, thermal mass, body heat management, emergency protocols, these aren't museum pieces or historical curiosities. They're solutions developed by people who couldn't afford to get things wrong, tested by families whose survival depended on perfection, refined through generations who understood that knowledge is more valuable than any possession because knowledge can't be stolen, broken, or used up. There's a particular kind of sleep that comes from earned exhaustion and confident preparation, the deep rest of people who have done everything necessary to ensure their family's safety and comfort. Frontier families knew this sleep intimately, drifting off to the sound of wind that couldn't hurt them, secure in cabins that had been engineered for survival, warmed by systems they understood completely. Their rest was profound because it was earned through competence rather than purchased through convenience. The modern world offers us different comforts, but perhaps we can learn something from these frontier families about the deep satisfaction that comes from understanding the systems that sustain us, from being prepared for challenges rather than assuming someone else will handle them, from finding peace in the rhythm of purposeful work that actually matters for survival and comfort. As your mind settles into the easy rhythm of sleep, let it wander through that 1880 cabin where children dream peacefully beside heated stones, where parents rest knowing their fire will burn until morning, where families found security not in locks or alarms, but in their own understanding of how to create warmth from cold, comfort from hardship, and peace from preparation. The frontier is gone, but the satisfaction of being genuinely prepared never gets old, and the sleep that comes from confidence in your own competence remains one of life's deepest comforts. Sweet dreams from all of us here at American Sleepless Story. If you didn't fall asleep during the introduction, drop a comment about what decade or type of story you'd like to hear next. Maybe something about the boring satisfaction of running a general store in 1870s Kansas, or the quietly meditative work of operating a lighthouse on the Great Lakes. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications if you'd like more of these sleepless American stories that celebrate the art of finding peace in times when peace had to be earned one careful decision at a time. Rest well tonight, knowing that your ancestors figured out how to survive impossible conditions with nothing but ingenuity, preparation, and the deep comfort that comes from understanding exactly how to take care of the people you love.